So first of all, I want to thank Taxpayer Protection Alliance for organizing this panel and inviting me to moderate. This was, be careful, a big mistake, but it's okay. So we have a great panelist today. The topic is very interesting, the plain packaging and tobacco harm reduction. So we have a great panelist like Professor Sinclair Davidson, Guy Bentley, and Professor Colin Mendelsohn. So we're going to talk about one of the most detrimental anti-IP policy that's been implemented in Australia in 2012. So next December there will be 7 years of failure of this policy. Plain packaging, for if you're not familiar, basically is the banning of the trademark and logo in cigarette packages, and with the main goal is to, according to the Australian government, to reduce the smoking rate. So we will listen from Professor Sinclair, one of the leading experts, why this policy failed, not only in reducing the smoking rate, but also is failing because by itself, by its nature, is affecting the intellectual property right that they are protected by international treaty. So, so far there are 17 countries that's been implemented this type of policy. As I said, Australia, United Kingdom, France, Canada, Georgia, Hungary, Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, Slovenia, Singapore, or Uruguay, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Turkey, and Congo, Brazzaville. So the WHO, the World Health Organization, has been pushing for this policy without thinking that, oh, maybe they don't care about this is a direct attack of the intellectual property right, something that we really care. We also care about the health of us, so everyone. So this is also another example, and Professor Sinclair he will explain that there are different other options, and we will explain with the data why this policy failed. We are moving to a second topic, this is harm reduction, so like vaping, e-cigarette, and it could be an alternative to traditional tobacco product. So saying that, I want to invite Professor Sinclair. She's a professor of institutional economics in the School of Economics and Finance and Marketing from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and especially thank you to the sponsors for organising again and sponsoring again what is a magnificent conference every year. So I actually want to start off by actually making more of a moral kind of argument. I was speaking to a Swedish group of retailers a few years ago about plain packaging, and I was doing my usual story of running through the numbers and telling people, oh, you know, how it's failed and what have you. And in the end, one of the retailers put up his hand and he said, you know, Sinclair, that's very nice. You telling us all about numbers and what have you, but why haven't you made a moral argument against plain packaging? Why aren't you arguing for the morality or against the morality of government telling us what we can do with our lives? And I was put back because here in Australia we don't think about morals. It's all very utilitarian. So I actually think it's quite important to make the moral argument that we shouldn't surrender our principles to the state. Because once you do that, more or less, you're on a slippery slope. And the other thing, of course, is a point that I like to make more and more is that this is actually part of a much broader anti-business, anti-capitalist approach that we're seeing in the world today, which Mises warned us about in the 1930s. And of course, we just have to realize that entrepreneurs sell things to people what they want. It's not the entrepreneur's fault that we prefer liquor to Bibles and detective stories to serious books and all this sort of stuff. So we should actually not lose track of the moral argument. Now, what is plain packaging? There we have the example from a packet of Marlboro would have been, say, the 1980s. Early 1990s looked something like that. And then the warnings came in. It was a written warning. In 2006, we got the graphic health warning. So we moved from looking at words to actually looking at what I call medical pornography. And in 2012, what we did was we moved from much bigger medical pornography, and we took away all the branding and the copyrights. All the owner's rights, intellectual property in that packet has now been extinguished, and it was replaced by what is an olive green packet with a standardized font, standardized locations. Now, it's not called olive green, it's called daub brown. And it's not called olive green because the Olive Growers Association complained bitterly that they were being associated with tobacco products. So that's where we are now. So two things changed. It's very important to observe that the two things that happened is that the warning label became much, much bigger, and to all the intellectual property in the packet was extinguished and replaced by a standardized packet. There are actually two reforms in here, and the government actually commissioned the Victorian Cancer Council to investigate those two things, and they actually didn't do that. So very importantly, I always like to emphasize this point. What were the policy objectives? Now, the policy objectives were to discourage people from smoking, to encourage people to give up smoking, and to discourage relapsing. Okay, those are the policy objectives, to reduce the incidence of tobacco consumption in Australia. Then we have the mechanisms, how it's going to happen. Very quietly, people have forgotten about the actual policy objectives and are now simply focusing on the mechanisms of what was going to happen. But certainly that's the policy. Please note also there's nothing in there about children smoking. This is actually just the overall policy. So now, how has that worked for you? So what we've got here is data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, and and it's from the early 1990s down to 2016, which is the latest available data, and down to 2013 we see a very nice downward sloping line. Tobacco consumption in Australia has been declining for decades and nothing changed more or less. And then we also have all the different policies that we introduced, so bans on advertising, and so on and so forth, point of display bans. And then all of a sudden 2013, there we are, 2013, the data came out right after the policy came into effect, and people said, glorious victory, smoking down. Well, glorious victory, nothing. What actually happened, despite massive increases in excise tax, the rate of decline actually stopped. That is not statistically significantly different from what it was before, and given population growth, the fact is now there are more people smoking in Australia than what there were in 2013. Now, this is the government's own data. You know, I didn't make up this data. This is their data. That is their graph. Okay, I have redrawn it, but this is their data, their graph. So kind of a bit of a failure. But to their credit, what the government did do in 2012, 2013, is they commissioned the Victorian Cancer Council to do a series of studies, to do a tracking survey, to see how the policy actually worked. And in a special issue of tobacco control, the results of that particular tracking study were put out. There are three important studies that came out of it, by the same six authors. So the same six people, just different ordering of the names on the papers to make it look different, but the same six people wrote these three papers, and it's actually quite interesting because I actually think what they did, their question, the way they went about it is more or less correct. So they started off by saying, did people respond to the health warnings? Yes, no. Did people's behavior modify as a result of the thing? Yes, no. And can you link the responses to the health labels to the quitting behavior? That to me seems a very sensible way of doing things. So you read through the papers, it seems very sensible, and the conclusions are that the policy is a glorious victory. But I got the data. So freedom of information request goes in, and they drag the train and so on and so forth, until my good friend David Lionhelm asked a few questions at Senate estimates, and they said, of course, we've sent the data to Professor Davidson, and 2 days later the data arrived. So it takes 2 days for something to be sent in Australia. 2 days later the data arrives. And so I've got the data, I look at the data, I read the studies again, I've now got a much clearer understanding of what's going on. What they've done across the three studies is that the sample period timing that they've used changes, the actual data that they use across the three studies changes, and the parts of the survey that they use change. So when you use a uniform methodology, uniform data, uniform timing, uniform variables, what you actually find is that the policy does not work. There is no statistically significant difference as a result of the policy. So the problems with this particular study are data mining, different data periods, different time, different variables. They don't test actual quitting behavior. For a $3 million survey, they don't ask the question, why did you stop smoking? Just not there, strange. And when you untangle all of this, the results are simply not robust. So my good friend Ashton De Silva and I put this paper out. It's on the Social Science Research Network for you to have a look at if you want to. We have replicated all of their results. They haven't actually lied on the regressions themselves. They're exactly correct, but the conclusions and how they've derived them is profoundly dishonest in my opinion. But of course, we put out the results, Social Science Research Network, in I think it's 14 pages, the paper. With some tables. The Victorian Cancer Council put out a 16-page press release debunking it. So their press release saying that our study is wrong is even longer than our actual study. But don't believe me. Believe the World Trade Organization. So Australia got sued at the World Trade Organization for violation of intellectual property rights to their discredit. The WTO actually upheld Australia's claim, but they actually looked at the evidence presented in the Wakefield studies. These are the judges of the World Trade Organization, and they use words such as results are limited and mixed, more limited and mixed, very limited and mixed, statistically not significant. So the World Trade Organization, in their judgment, rubbished this particular analysis undertaken by the Victorian Cancer Council. All right, so the government are in trouble. The most damning assessment is, even though they threw out the Victorian Cancer Council results, they accepted junk science. And this particular graph was in the regulatory impact statement done by Dr. Chipty. She is a consultant to the Australian government. She advised the government in their WTO case, and they produced this graph in the regulatory impact statement, showing a very nice downward sloping line. Policy introduced, and there we see the rate of declining smoking increases. Isn't it glorious? The policy has succeeded. So what do? They say, well, this is the evidence that we possibly want. And of course, you kind of see some of the arguments that you're up against. So Mike Daub says, when the study comes out, he says, it's especially rewarding this meticulous independent analysis attributes part of that decline to plain packaging alone. When you read that meticulous independent analysis, it actually says it is not possible to identify separately the effects of tobacco packaging and graphic health warnings. Literally direct contradiction. But anyway, so here we have the actual data. Another freedom of information request goes in, and they give me this summary data. There it is. And how did Dr. Chipty produce her results? Well, she truncated the data in 2012 and then drew two lines. Literally, truncated in 2012, drew a trend line, truncated after 2012, drew another trend line. Okay, when you actually draw a trend line through the entire data, that is what you get. Okay, there is no structural break in the data at 2012. No structural data break at all, to the extent that there might be a structural break somewhere around 2004, but generally speaking, she literally drew the trend lines in by truncating the data. Absolutely astonishing. But there's also another part of the analysis, which unfortunately I haven't been able to get the underlying data to this. She has a model with 80,000 observations, 52 explanatory variables, but not price. So when she models why people smoke cigarettes, the price of the packet of cigarettes does not enter into her analysis. So price doesn't matter, apparently. And she runs her regressions. Now, the first thing you got to notice is when you're running very large databases, Lindley's paradox, a large N makes it more likely that you will find something statistically significant. So she makes no adjustments for Lindley's paradox. She's also got a very unusual base in her model. An unmarried Australian-born teenager, 14 to 17-year-old, with a tertiary education, employed full-time on an income less than $6,000 living in Victoria. This person smoked less as a result of the policy. Okay, a non-existent person stopped smoking, which is absolutely astonishing. If you find such a person, please call the police. Certainly their employer is not paying them the minimum wage. But what she actually finds, and I mean this is an interesting result, she actually finds that 0.55% decline in tobacco consumption over her sample period can be attributed to plain packaging. That's very nice. Except Her sample error is 0.6%. So her effect, what she finds, is smaller than the sample error. The other thing that she finds is the pseudo R-squareds, or she reports very pseudo R-squareds, are very, very low. The highest one is about 10%. So 800,000 observations, she can't explain more than 10% of the variation in the data. So there's a 90% error rate in her model, and she can explain half of 1%, which is smaller than the sample error. This data is not available for replication, so we have to take that with a grain of salt. So who do we believe? Do we believe the government's own data, which kind of shows that there's been an increase, or so certainly the rate of decline in smoking has declined, or do we believe Dr. Chipty, who tells us it's gone down? So we can believe the government's data, we can believe the government's consultant. Okay, so what is going on? Well, warning awareness declined, I suspect, because people stopped looking at the packets. Okay, you have now got a standardized, very ugly packet. The studies, the Victorian Cancer Council studies, everybody agrees these packets are unattractive. It's not surprising. People stop looking at the packets. When they stop looking at the packets, they stop looking at the warning sign. If you have a look at the data, which they don't make a fuss about it at all, but if you have a look, the graphic health warnings, the 2006 graphic health warnings does actually deter people from smoking. The picture, the medical pornography does. But if you surround that medical pornography with an unattractive packet, nobody looks at the unattractive packet, nobody looks at the medical pornography. So that explains why the policy has actually failed. And you can actually see that in the data. The effectiveness of the graphic health warning declines after the introduction of plain packaging, which is, of course, exactly the opposite to the mechanisms and the stated objective. Premium pricing brands was undermined. People are effectively smoking cheaper. So you're not paying $25 or so for your packet of cigarettes. You're paying $13 for a packet of cheapies. Unsurprisingly, price goes down, people smoke more. The anti-tobacco industry itself is being disrupted by new products, which I think is hilariously funny, because all those guys, if everybody stopped smoking cigarettes and started vaping, those guys will be out of jobs. They'd better be at Centrelink or something. But anyway, so they've been disrupted by new products, which of course explains the hardline attacks on vaping. But this is an attack on intellectual property rights. And that is actually a problem here. I mean, even if you don't care about smoking, you should actually care about intellectual property rights. I mean, we are moving to a digitized economy, we're moving to a service economy. Intellectual property rights make up a very important part of that. And of course, this is a part of a broader attack on the advertising industry itself. We are seeing more and more calls for more and more products to be subject to plain packaging. So plain packaging has failed to meet its stated objectives in Australia. Of course, if your objective is to annoy the tobacco industry, it's been a glorious success. But if your objective is actually to stop people from smoking, it has been a complete failure. The only evidence is junk science. And of course, this is more or less what's happening in France as well. So the French health minister said in 2016, official sales of cigarettes increased after the introduction of plain packaging, and in the United Kingdom as well. So the policy certainly hasn't seemed to work anywhere, well, certainly in those three economies, the exact opposite to what was expected. How to find me? I have a plain packaging resources page, where all my stuff is up there. So if you just Google Sinclair Davidson plain packaging resources, you will find my resources page and all sorts of information, what have you. And the papers are at Social Science Research Network, or you can follow my blog or follow me on Twitter. And thank you very much.
So we are moving now to harm reduction. So we have Guy Bentley, he's the Director of Consumer Freedom for Reason Foundation. It's a no-profit think tank advancing free mind and free market. And he's going to talk about the vapor revolution and how free market innovation solve public health problems.
Thank you for that, and excellent talk by Sinclair. Good afternoon, everyone. As I said, my name's Guy Bentley. I'm Director of Consumer Freedom at the Reason Foundation. We're a libertarian think tank based in the United States, and we also publish Reason Magazine and Reason TV. As is probably obvious, I'm from the UK originally, so it was particularly delightful to have Theresa May's career served up over dinner halfway through last night. As if there were more things to celebrate at this conference. It's absolutely incredible. So I think vaping and tobacco harm reduction, this is a particularly great area for libertarians because often we're arguing, as Sink was saying about earlier, about the morality of things. For instance, we always take the John Stuart Mill line that you should be free to do with your life whatever you choose so long as you don't harm anybody else. And we make these arguments when it comes to food or gambling, tobacco, lots of other products. But when it comes to vaping, we're talking about not just the freedom to do harm to yourself, but the freedom to actually make yourself better off. The freedom to actually quit smoking and switch to something that is much safer. Now, we go back to how this first started. The modern-day e-cigarette was invented by a Chinese pharmacist called Hon Lik back in about 2003. He was a heavy smoker, his dad had died of lung cancer through smoking, and he had tried everything under the sun to try and quit. Nothing worked for him. So he invented something himself, entrepreneurial guy, and he managed to create a device that vaporized liquid nicotine with propylene glycol and some flavorings, and it worked for him. And I think in a more just world, this invention and what he did, I think he really should be christened nicotine's version of Norman Borlaug, the great scientist who created golden rice and is purported to have saved around 1 billion people's lives from preventing famine with that innovation. And what Hon Lik did sparked a global innovation race, which essentially created thousands of companies all over the world competing with each other to make it fun to quit smoking, which I thought was like an amazing thing. You talked about 20 years ago where you'd have all these companies competing with each other to create a fun, easier alternative to smoking. You would have been laughed out of the room, but that's exactly what's happened. And so how were these products greeted by the traditional anti-tobacco lobby? This wasn't celebrated as something that is the greatest anti-smoking device that's ever been invented, or the greatest danger to the traditional tobacco industry in the last 50 years. It was instantly demonized. It was like, is vaping really safer? Is it going to renormalize smoking somehow? Half groping towards the cliches from the war on drugs. Is this going to be a gateway for young people? Does it really help people quit smoking? And this was really summed up in 2015 by former director of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, who said, e-cigarettes will prompt young people to take up smoking, and I recommend that national governments ban or at least regulate them. This is purportedly the world's leading health official. This is also the same person who said that North Korea's lack of obesity was due to them not living sedentary lifestyles. So we're really getting fantastic advice from the World Health Organization. So in response to this general hysteria, different governments took different approaches. In the UK, actually took an incredibly liberal approach to vaping in these products. The UK government has a department, a team called the Behavioural Insights Team, which tries to introduce behavioural economics into public policy. And their attitude was to let vaping be. Let's see how it develops, see if people take it up, see if it works. And David Halpern, who used to run the Behavioural Insights team in his book on the department called the Nudge Unit, said it was the greatest thing they probably ever did for public health. There are now 3 million people who vape in the UK. The smoking rate has continued to decline precipitously. Interestingly, hardly any young people are even vaping or taking it up. It's been a great success. On the European Union level, unfortunately, that we had the European Tobacco Products Directive, which, along with other silly policies like banning menthol cigarettes, decided to regulate the nicotine content in e-cigarettes and the bottle size and so on, but short of full-scale prohibition, so small graces. In the United States, in 2016, we had something called the deeming rule that was introduced. And what that essentially did is it deemed e-cigarettes to be tobacco products, which e-cigarettes do not contain any tobacco whatsoever. Most of them contain nicotine, most of which is derived from tobacco, but they absolutely do not contain tobacco. Saying e-cigarettes contain tobacco is like saying, well, I don't know, milk is derived from cows, but I don't pour steak on my cornflakes. It's really apples to oranges comparison. And what the deeming rule did is it made sure that if you want to sell e-cigarettes in the United States, you have to submit these huge application forms to the Food and Drug Administration, which pretty much no independent e-cigarette company can create. And when they have to submit these applications by 2021, about 99% of them will go out of business and the industry will be totally dominated by traditional tobacco companies and maybe 1 or 2 major e-cigarette producers. and there's been huge moral hysteria in the United States when it comes to vaping. Just at the time that we're finally legalizing marijuana, we're now creating a new panic over people vaping nicotine for reasons as of yet unexplained. And of course, here in Australia, it's illegal to sell nicotine-containing e-cigarettes. We have full prohibition, which Colin Mendelsohn is doing great work to try and finally try and overturn. But what has changed since all these policies were introduced several years ago is that the debate really has changed in terms of the science. We know now, without any shadow of a doubt, vaping is far safer than smoking. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine said with their highest level of confidence, there is conclusive proof that people who transition from combustible cigarettes to e-cigarettes significantly reduce their exposure to toxicants. It's been confirmed by Royal College of Physicians, Public Health England, and so on. We know that they work. There was always skepticism. It was like, okay, they're safer, but do they actually help people quit smoking? In January of this year, we had a study from the New England Journal of Medicine, a randomized control trial showing that people who vaped rather than using traditional nicotine replacement therapy were about twice as likely to successfully quit smoking. In terms of a so-called gateway effect, is this encouraging young people to start smoking? In the United States, since 2011, young people experimenting with vaping has gone up significantly. But what's happened to the youth smoking rate? It's halved. It has absolutely crashed and plummeted, and is continuing to go down. Same in the UK, we see no effect of increased smoking rates amongst youth due to vaping. So we know that this bottom-up innovation has worked. It's safer. It costs the taxpayers nothing. People are creating jobs and livelihoods by helping people quit smoking. So then there's a somewhat more rational case for tobacco harm reduction, an instrumental technocratic approach. But I think, as Sinclair was saying, morality is also a big part of this as well. Because I think what drives the crusade against vaping is, as was mentioned, if cigarettes are put out of business by vaping and IQOS and all these new products, what do the anti-tobacco movement do? They've got to shut up shop and leave all their jobs, because it's not just about the harms of smoking for many people in the tobacco control industry. It's a puritanical hatred of recreational nicotine. This fairly mild stimulant is something they absolutely hate. And this was brought to the fore by Mitch Zeller, who's the head of the Center for Tobacco Products at the FDA. He's writing an article on tobacco control and said, how comfortable are we with long-term or possibly permanent use of less harmful nicotine delivery mechanisms by adults? And I think just by posing the question, you know what his answer will be. They're not comfortable at all. What they would like is to have these products medicalized, and you could quit smoking through vaping, and then eventually it'll be to eliminate vaping. I quit smoking 2 years ago. I vape, and people are like, well, why don't you give up vaping? Are you addicted to nicotine? And I was like, well, one, I don't know. Two, I don't care. Because I enjoy it. And you have an absolute right to do something like that. Just shortly after prohibition of alcohol in the United States, one of the big slogans for the Women's Christian Temperance Union was nicotine next. And precisely nothing has actually changed since then. We can get rid of smoking by consumers transitioning to something that they find satisfying and is far safer, but nicotine will still be there, just like as there is a market for all kinds of drugs and experiences, and nicotine is one of the biggest with more than 1 billion users worldwide. So I think it's important both that we have a fantastic marriage of bottom-up free market innovation and libertarian ideas actually working in conjunction with public health, not against it. Usually we're on the opposite sides of these issues. So I think it's a really important winning case to say, not only we can save tens of millions of lives through consumers satisfying their own preferences. It's literally a libertarian dream ticket policy. So I really hope we have much more success, and Colin's doing great work on this to try and overturn some of the ridiculous bans and regulations we have on these products here in Australia and everywhere else. So fingers crossed, hopefully the science and the rationality will win out, but also the argument just for consumer choice and that people being able to live their lives in whichever way they want, including if you want to vape nicotine. Thanks very much. Cheers.
We have a very sad story in Australia, but we are fighting on regardless. Just to point out first that I have no conflicts of interest, in spite of what you might hear in the media. I'm not paid by big tobacco or the vaping industry. And this has been a narrative that's been repeatedly claimed. In relation to our organisation, the Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association, we are a health promotion charity relying on public funding. We have received donations from the vape industry, as any charity does, from organisations that support what they're doing. We took one donation from a private harm reduction agency in the UK. We do not accept donations from the tobacco industry. So what I'm going to be talking about is the barriers to vaping in Australia and what's happening in other countries in comparison, the consequences of that in Australia, and the advocacy that we're doing. So, as Guy's pointed out, vaping's basically a less harmful alternative for adult smokers who otherwise can't or don't want to quit nicotine. So there are millions of smokers who do not want to quit smoking, who enjoy their smoking, who enjoy the use of nicotine, and many of whom have tried to quit and have not been able to. And what vaping does, and why it's unique, is that it not only replicates the hand-to-mouth ritual and the sensory effects and the social aspects of vaping, of nicotine, but it delivers nicotine without the tar, and that's what kills people. So we're letting people continue the habit that they are addicted to or enjoy, but we're giving them the drug that they also enjoy, which is a relatively benign recreational stimulant that people should choose to use as they do caffeine. As Guy was saying, we have the evidence now. This is not about the evidence. We know these products are probably 95% safer than smoking, certainly far less harmful. We know that vaping is 2 to 3 times as effective as nicotine replacement therapy, which is endorsed by the government and promoted by the pharmaceutical industry. There was a paper published last week which found that in the UK, in a population of 20,000 people, people who vaped were 3 times more likely to quit than people who were prescribed nicotine replacement products. People who bought NRT over the counter from the chemist had no outcome, no benefit from that. Vaping works. Yes, there are all these issues that are being raised about why we shouldn't let people vape. I would suggest that these are justifications or rationalisations for some of the issues that Guy's raised. We hate big tobacco. We don't want people using nicotine. This is not the way we do things. So they're looking for excuses, and one by one we're dismantling them. So Australia is quite unique in that it's the only Western democracy which bans the sale and use of nicotine for vaping. You can see from this picture that vaping is, of course, legal and widely used in Canada, in the US, in the UK, across Europe, even in New Zealand, I have to say, which is a little bit embarrassing. New Zealand's racing ahead and leading the way in this area. And Australia is, as you can see, the only OECD country, apart from Japan and Mexico, to ban vaping. In Australia, that's because we regard nicotine as a dangerous poison in our national scheduling document. So it's a criminal offence to possess or use nicotine liquid in Australia, unless you have a prescription from a doctor which says you're trying to quit smoking. The exceptions to this rule are you're allowed to have cigarettes which contain nicotine. They've been specifically exempted from this law. And you're allowed to have nicotine gums and patches, but you're not allowed to have nicotine liquid to use to help you quit smoking. And the state laws are equally harsh. So the state laws basically regulate vaping as a tobacco product with all the restrictions on vaping as if it was a tobacco product in terms of advertising and display and promotion and so on. So we have very harsh regulations. It's a de facto ban, basically. And what's extraordinary in Australia is that we have almost universal opposition to vaping. So we're talking about the Federal Health Department, our peak medical and health body, the National Health and Medical Research Council, our regulator, our equivalent of the FDA, the TGA. Every single state and territory health department is opposed to vaping. Nearly all medical and health associations including the AMA, the Royal Australian College of Physicians, Thoracic Society, are opposed to vaping and have position statements against it. All the health charities are opposed to vaping. There is some hope. There are a couple of medical organisations that are in favour, who have seen the light, who are willing to break ranks from the groupthink approach, which is driving a lot of this antagonism. Well, we think vaping's bad, and well, he does too, and he does too, so yeah, we'll all go along with that. Two organisations have broken free from that, and we're hoping that more will take that step. Because as someone was saying this morning, it's about kind of changing your identity and changing your tribe. If you look at the evidence and decide that actually what everyone on my team is saying is wrong, it's very hard to isolate yourself socially and professionally and change teams. And in Australia, very few people are willing to change teams because this message, this narrative has been repeated so frequently. So smokers in Australia have a choice like Sophie. Now, a lot of you aren't old enough to remember Sophie. Sophie, this was a movie from, I think, 1982 with Meryl Streep, and Sophie was a Polish lady who was sent to Auschwitz with her two children. She had to choose between her daughter or her son being sent to the gas chamber to be killed, or the other going to a labour camp. Very powerful movie. And smokers really have that, and I don't want to trivialise the Holocaust, but smokers have that choice. If you keep smoking, according to Australian data, your chance of death is 2 in 3 from smoking. You will die prematurely from smoking, and your chance of that is 2 in 3. And you lose, on average, 10 years of life. And many smokers just simply cannot quit. The alternative is to break the law and vape. Actually, to break the law, become a criminal, and take up vaping. That's happened. 1.2% of Australians are actually vaping, according to the national figures. That's about 230,000 Australians have chosen to break the law and vape rather than die from smoking. That's a very small number by international standards, and these are the latest data from most countries. The American rates, US rates, were much higher, but they have dropped down. In the UK, it's about 6.2% of the population. But Australia is clearly very low, down here in near Mexico, where vaping is banned. The consequences of this are, as you've been told by Sinclair, a very slow rate in decline of smoking. So since 2013, in our national smoking study, or drug tobacco strategy, smoking rates did not decline in that 3-year period from 2013 to 16. In our other major national survey, they did not decline from 2015 to 2018. There was no significant decline. Why that's important is that if you overlay the decline in smoking rates in the UK, the green line, and the smoking rates from the national surveys in the US in the red line, you can see that the rates of decline are falling much faster since vaping became widely available in those countries. Now, we can't say it's all due to vaping, but it's certain to be partly due to vaping. And certainly, if plain packaging is playing any role here, this is even worse. And, we deny smokers the right to choose a less expensive and more effective option to quit. We have the highest smoking prices in the world. $29 for a pack of 20 Marlboro. In the UK, it's about 20 Australian dollars. In the US, it's about 10. And in spite of that, rates are not continuing to fall. Clearly, smoking prices are less effective than they were in the past, and this is especially a problem for people on low incomes, who are the main smokers these days. We've been relying on aggressive tax rises, 25% in 2010, 12.5% every year they go up since 2013. Smoking prices have tripled in 10 years, faster than anything. Even electricity, we're hearing about that all the time. This is the fastest rising consumer product in Australia. And what effect is it having? Making people poor and miserable. Is it having an effect on illicit tobacco? It's really hard to be sure. It's very hard to get accurate figures. The figures for illicit tobacco are estimated to be between 6 to 28% of the total tobacco market. But we're constantly seeing proud claims by the Tobacco Border Force. Look at all this wonderful tobacco we're claiming on the border, and people are growing it in farms illegally. Isn't that great? Actually, no, it's not really helping. Just like the war on drugs doesn't help. It might be saving the government a bit of tax temporarily, but it's not having any other effect. There's a complete lack of regulation and safety standards in Australia with vaping. So that studies like these in the Medical Journal of Australia found that, yes, there's nicotine in some products, because it's illegal to say this product has nicotine. So you buy, if you're buying in Australia, you don't know what you're getting. There's no regulation on safety standards. So unfortunately, there's no law saying you have to have a childproof bottle. And this unfortunate situation occurs. Hasn't been proven yet, but there appears to have possibly been one death in Australia from nicotine liquid, as opposed to 19,000 deaths per year from vaping, from smoking. Vapers are criminals. Although there have only been a handful of convictions, this is hanging over vapers. They're intimidated, and smokers, and many will not switch. We get emails all the time saying, I want to switch to vaping. How do I do this? I know it's illegal. How do I get nicotine? Because I believe it's illegal. We get that through ATHRA all the time. If you're in Western Australia, the fine's $45,000 every time you're found with nicotine in possession. In 3 states, you can go to jail for up to 2 years. Now, it hasn't been enforced, but it's no wonder people are terrified of taking up vaping. There is some advocacy, and now for the good news. Very poorly funded advocacy groups like the Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Foundation. I went to the talk on funding earlier with great interest. We have a budget of 0 almost, but we are a health promotion charity, ATHRA, formed by doctors, established to raise awareness of vaping because of the public health benefit. And we lobby, we educate the public, we run campaigns. I'll come back to that in a moment. We have wonderful people like Brian, who runs Legalise Vaping. So that's an Australian Taxpayers Alliance organisation. They do wonderful work with politics, social media and media, and they run the Vape Force One, the bus around Australia telling people what a wonderful thing vaping is, and it really helps. And we have the New Nicotine Alliance, a consumer advocacy group who are still struggling to get going. Finally, I just wanted to raise awareness of Aussie Vape Day. This is an event being held next Thursday. It's the first of its kind, the first ever Aussie Vape Day, and it's encouraging smokers to give it a go. So we're using videos. We've had videos made, including by Joe Hildebrand, a well-known vapor, a celebrity vapor. We have information sheets like how do you actually go about vaping. The interesting thing is we're not allowed to use the N-word. We cannot say you actually get nicotine. We can't use that N-word. We have to say an active ingredient. And if you speak to your doctor, he may feel it's appropriate to give you a prescription. We can't say you need to get nicotine from New Zealand. We have to say go to your doctor because that's what's required. Because legally, the only way to do it legally is for the doctors to write a script. But, of course, the doctors will not write prescriptions. There are only 3 or 4 doctors in Australia I know of that writes prescriptions for nicotine, and I'm one of them. So we get emails all the time. How do I get a prescription for nicotine? I want to stop smoking. How do I do that legally? We have testimonials. We've produced videos as part of this campaign and printed stories from vapers who have quit smoking. We're doing a lot of mainstream and social media. We're having a launch event, which Brian's organising on Thursday, and you're very welcome to come along to Ryde Park. And finally, we have a website which has all this information. Things like instructions for doctors on how to prescribe nicotine, frequently asked questions about vaping, quoting authoritative and independent organisations, lots of videos and information. So under difficult circumstances, we're doing the best we can. And if you'd like to make a donation to ATHRA, donations over $2 are tax deductible. Thank you.
There is a general question about how to start the libertarian vaping revolution. So I think this is for 2 guys.
Absolutely, very much needed here. Well, definitely, obviously, ATHRA, Colin's organisation is great to get in contact with, and other campaigns being run by taxpayer advocacy groups. But also, one of the key ways to start sort of campaigning in this way is also to reach out to international organisations, which are also doing this as well. There's the New Nicotine Alliance in the UK. There's groups like SAFATA and CASAR in the United States, who are great at getting in contact with groups and want to share their wisdom and advocacy and what they've been doing, because there are dozens of these groups across the world to try and campaign to get either different tax rates or regulatory regimes. So there is a sort of global community about vaping now, with active advocacy groups that would be more than happy to share and get in touch as well. And also at Reason Foundation, we'd also be absolutely happy to work with and collaborate with groups here in Australia and anywhere else to contribute and do what we can, either whether that's contacting legislatures or submitting evidence to parliamentary inquiries or writing op-eds and articles and so on. We're also more than happy to help out with that.
You want to add something on?
Oh, look, the only thing I want to say is that in Australia, I think the best bang for our buck is for people to write to and visit their members of parliament and to write to their local newspapers. I think we're only going to win this through the political process and through a mass movement from within the community. I mean, the AMA president would not meet with me to discuss this issue. Cancer Council Australia would not meet with me to discuss this issue. So that's the sort of closed-minded resistance we're up against. I think we have to find a way around that by convincing people and the politicians who are increasingly supportive, except for Greg Hunt.
Yes. Thank you. We have an up question, so we have another one from Port Sinclair. So when you try to attend public health event or present your evidence to health bureaucracy, what is the response and how do they react?
This has been very interesting, actually. I've made submissions all over the world around the failure of plain packaging, and it's actually quite important to make the argument that plain packaging has failed, because during the week the Netherlands have a consultation where they're concerned about youth smoking, and so their solution to the youth smoking problem is to introduce a plain packaging argument. And of course you've got to make the argument, well, not only did plain packaging not work generally speaking, specifically the evidence in Australia is that it failed, and that's in the medical journals. I haven't even done that myself, but so I've actually made many submissions around the world, and this year I made a submission to the Australian Health Department, who are running a consultation. It was going to be next Thursday, and on Friday afternoon I received an email uninviting me to this thing, having been invited to appear. They sent me an email saying it would not be appropriate for me to attend at all, and this would be a violation of the FTCT, the World Health Organization Anti-Tobacco Protocol, which actually says that the public health lobby must be protected from evil, nasty doers like my good self, I imagine. But I've certainly followed up with the health department. I sent a very polite email, I thought, to them, saying on Friday afternoon that their information was false. I've also contacted my political representatives to express my dissatisfaction, and I've spoken to them as well. So I imagine I will be appearing at some stage and talking to somebody. But yes, Mr. Hunt is a problem. I was very excited when it looked like he might lose his seat at the general election, but alas, there was not to be.
Can I just make one comment? A board member from ATHRA was invited to the same consultation session in Sydney last week, was asked to leave the meeting because of a conflict of interest. Before we had the opportunity, before they discussed electronic cigarettes.
Just a question for Guy and the rest of the panel. You mentioned in your talk that as a result of some of the regulatory burdens that are being set up by the Food and Drug Administration, in the next couple of years, smaller business vaping industry will probably get crushed by that, and then the only people left will be the tobacco companies that we're all supposed to be concerned about something. Here, health bureaucrats say, well, if you want to legalise vaping, it has to go through the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Would you, from my perspective, I think that's something that will probably, again, undermine smaller vaping industries to only benefit the two industries that they say that they don't want in on this area. Is that sort of a global trend that's happening, or is it mainly just an American thing?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because when we talk about the specific regulatory regime for e-cigarettes, for instance, in Australia, we're starting from sort of ground zero here. A lot of the anti-vaping or anti-tobacco people will say, okay, well, if these things are so great, why don't we make them essentially medicalized products? You could get them on prescription or something like that. And that fundamentally misunderstands how vaping works. Vaping works because it's an enjoyable consumer product that competes with cigarettes on its own terms. You can go into a store, you can buy them like any other product, you can choose the flavors, you can choose the device, and so on. It needs to be an appealing product that consumers actually want to buy. Unlike, nicotine replacement therapy and nicotine gums and all that, which are hopelessly ineffective, nicotine replacement therapies are generally gigantic failures because smokers are not patients. They're ordinary consumers. They live their lives. Don't actually want to be medicalized and prodded and treated like children. Smoking, you can get diseases from smoking, but the behavior itself is not a disease. It's a perfectly rational consumer choice. So definitely the regulatory regime treating it like a medicalized product would be disastrous for vaping. It would make it incredibly ineffective. But exactly the barriers to entry, you need a liberalized market here, because otherwise, you need the competition from all these small individual companies with the big tobacco companies who now have their own e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products like IQOS and things, and that's all for the better. But they were forced into this. They're being forced to compete to satisfy their consumers with an enjoyable drug that eventually won't kill their customer base. So yeah, leaving it either in the hands of medical regulators or regulating the industry so much that really the only players in town are Philip Morris and Altria and R.J. Reynolds would be disastrous as well.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes for a question from the public. Anyone want to take opportunity? Philip?
How does the recent election affect vaping policy, clean packaging policy? Will there be new regulators or anything like that?
No, I don't anticipate. So the question is, will the election results of last week change anything in Australia? I suspect not. I imagine the existing or the pre-existing health minister, Mr. Hunt, said that he would not allow vaping at all, and I don't anticipate he will change his mind. But the government was re-elected, so the plain packaging more or less has sort of disappeared off the Australian radar. I don't anticipate there'll be any changes there. What I do anticipate, however, is that if you, after a while, if people start harassing their members of parliament, and you should always harass your member of parliament, if people start harassing their members of parliament and actually making demands, and over time it may change. But that is a much slower process. And I also think if people would harass Mr. Hunt, he's a I don't know why he's in the Liberal Party at all, but yes, I would certainly speak to your members of parliament all the time. You've got 12 senators. Go and speak to your senators. That's actually the way to go about it.
There's a couple here if you want to go talk.
They're already convinced.
Yes. So I have a question for you, Sinclair. We know that a lot of countries we start with tobacco product, plain packaging, and they are moving to other industry like wine, sugar, soft drink, and what is the debate in Australia regarding, for example, plain packaging for wine? I'm saying that because I was in Georgia and with Gia Janderi that is here with us, and when we raised the point of plain packaging for the Georgian wine, the media and the politicians, they just like wake up and say, oh, we never thought about that. So because it's easy to attack tobacco industry, because everyone is scared to defend tobacco, and we are not here to defend any product. We are here to defend our freedom, to defend the freedom of choose our lifestyle, but also to defend mainly, from my point of view as a Property Right Alliance, intellectual property right. They are backbone for any free market economy. So what is the point of the debate regarding, for example, plain packaging on wine?
There has been talk about plain packaging of Australian wine, but that was from Indonesia. I suspect we would never plain package wine in Australia because Australia is a wine exporter. The other thing to understand about the tobacco industry is that they're all foreigners, and you can steal from foreigners with relative impunity. That's what they've done. But Australia as a wine exporter would probably suddenly rediscover the benefits of intellectual property rights if there was an attempt to plain package wine. There has been a lot of talk about plain packaging of fast foods. There was also an article I found once on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, always biased crap apparently, but on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation about plain packaged financial products, which you just, the mind boggles. I mean, you just don't even understand what this could possibly be. But so there was plain packaged financial products. There's also been talk about computer games, those sorts of things. But you'll tend to find Australia is, on the global stage, is a massive thief of intellectual property. We steal medical products from the rest of the world, mostly from the Americans. We steal Game of Thrones. We stole the tobacco industry's intellectual property rights. And most outrageously, the government said when they were, the High Court said in the thing is the government isn't taking the property for itself. Is just taken away from you. So therefore they don't have to pay compensation. But I imagine that if it actually turned out that it was something that would actually hit the hip pockets of Australian industry, all of a sudden intellectual property rights become very important. But until then, we're stealing from foreigners. It's a national sport.
Sure. Well, thank you everyone. I think it was very clear the message that if the government are serious to reduce the smoking rate, they should follow market innovation. They always a perfect solution to not affect our lifestyle, but also to pursue a specific health goal. It's very clear that plain packaging is the failure policy. Even if it would be successful, I would be against anyway because it's affecting intellectual property rights. And we see that the vaping revolution is something that in Australia has been stopped, and I really hope that with the new government, eventually with your campaign, can restart the debate. And even if we saw that the 95%, the vaping is 95% less harmful than regular tobacco product, there are countries and government, they are driven more by ideological approach rather than by data. So thank you everyone for this very interesting debate, and if you want to keep be informed, please follow us, and Taxpayer Protection Alliance is doing a great job in fighting plain packaging, and I think there is a lot to do again all over the world, and we need to stop this type of detrimental policy to defend our freedom mainly. Thank you.
Thank you.